If you've been watching the headlines, you've probably noticed all the noise about trade talks, tariffs, and tense summits between the United States and the European Union. But what if I told you the real story isn't happening in front of the cameras? Beneath the political speeches and the photo ops, there's a quiet, calculated shift taking place. One that could reshape the global economy for decades to come. For generations, Europe has been America's most reliable economic partner. Now, without fanfare or confrontation, it's slowly redrawing its alliances, finding new trade routes, and preparing for a future where Washington may not be the go-to power. This isn't rebellion, it's insurance. And the steps Europe is taking right now could change the balance of global power in ways that most people aren't seeing yet. Before we dig deeper into this fascinating shift, if you're finding this kind of global analysis valuable, hit that like button and share this video. It really helps get these stories out to more people who care about where the world is heading. In late July 2025, the US and EU signed a sweeping trade agreement to lower tariffs and strengthen economic ties. On paper, it looked like a breakthrough. US tariffs on European goods would drop from 30% to 15%, and the EU promised to buy $750 billion worth of American energy, technology, and defense products over the next decade. But then came the twist. Just days before the deal was to take effect, President Donald Trump, back on the campaign trail, made it crystal clear. If Europe didn't fully deliver on its commitments, he'd slap a 35% tariff on European exports. The warning was public, direct, and unmistakable. Brussels didn't respond with outrage or counter-threats. Instead, European leaders went quiet. But behind closed doors, frustration was boiling over. Some officials privately called it blackmail by design. Yet rather than launch a public fight, Europe began making quieter moves, building new partnerships, diversifying supply chains, and creating backup plans that would lessen its dependence on the US. One of the clearest signs of this shift is coming from France. President Emmanuel Macron has made several trips to Beijing since 2023, and while his speeches highlight climate change and green technology, the deals being signed tell a deeper story. French companies are now partnering with Chinese firms in nuclear energy, artificial intelligence, and sustainable infrastructure. Sectors that not long ago were the centerpiece of US-EU cooperation. French energy giant EDF is working with Chinese counterparts on advanced nuclear reactors, while AI labs in France are linking up with tech hubs in Shenzhen. Macron frames this as climate collaboration, but it's also about leverage. If the US pushes too hard, France now has another major partner to turn to. And Beijing is happy to oblige, investing in French ports, logistics, and renewable energy projects. It's a pivot in plain sight, just without the fanfare. Germany's approach is more understated, but no less significant. Berlin officially supports the transatlantic relationship, but German industry is increasingly intertwined with East Asia. In 2024, Germany's exports to China hit record highs, even as Washington pressed its allies to de-risk from Beijing. Volkswagen is building a $2.5 billion battery plant in China's Anhui province. BASF is developing a massive chemical complex in Zhanjiang. And German semiconductor firms are partnering with South Korea and Japan to sidestep US restrictions. The German government's own China strategy talks about reducing risk, but not cutting ties. For Germany, the logic is straightforward. Exports make up nearly half its economy, and China offers stability in a way that America's shifting political climate does not. That stability is hard to ignore when planning billion-euro investments. Trade between the EU and China topped $700 billion in 2024, making China the EU's largest goods trading partner. Freight trains now run regularly from Xi'an to Rotterdam in under 20 days, providing a fast alternative to shipping by sea. European ports like Duisburg, Valencia, and Piraeus are deeply linked to Chinese logistics systems. Even in technology, the connection remains strong. Huawei may be blocked from certain telecom networks, but its infrastructure still underpins parts of Europe's 5G rollout. Alipay and UnionPay are increasingly accepted in European cities, a quiet sign of deepening financial links. The US-EU bond has been weakening for years. From Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement, to the collapse of TTIP trade talks, to the CHIPS Act that excluded European firms from subsidies. The recent trade deal, with its massive commitments and tariff threats, has only deepened the sense in Europe that Washington's approach is now more transactional than cooperative. As French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire put it, the United States has embraced economic nationalism. Europe must respond with strategic autonomy. And that's exactly what Brussels is doing. Building its own defense funds, expanding digital sovereignty laws, and cutting energy dependence on both Russia and US LNG. By the way, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think Europe is making a smart move by building independence from the US? Or is it risking too much by getting closer to China? Drop a comment below. I read all of them, and your perspective really adds to the discussion. Washington's answer to Europe's hedging has been to reinforce trade barriers. Starting August 7th, a 10% general tariff will apply to most imports, with 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum unless countries cut special deals. The EU's recent tariff reductions in the US market are tied to heavy commitments and no reciprocal benefits from Washington. Meanwhile, China is taking the opposite approach, offering stable trade terms, financing infrastructure, and signing tailored bilateral agreements with EU states. Where the US is building walls, China is laying down trade corridors. It's not just France and Germany driving this shift. Smaller EU and European states are moving fast. Hungary is hosting one of Europe's biggest Chinese-built EV battery plants and keeping Huawei's European HQ in Budapest. Serbia is signing massive energy and infrastructure deals with China, deepening its dependence on Beijing. Italy, despite leaving the Belt and Road Initiative, is keeping Chinese investment in its key ports. Greece's Piraeus port, partly Chinese-owned, is now a major gateway for Chinese goods into Europe. These aren't symbolic moves, they're long-term bets. This isn't the end of the US-EU alliance. NATO isn't crumbling, and leaders on both sides still talk about partnership. But economically, the relationship is becoming more of a balancing act. Europe still works with the US, but it's no longer willing to be dependent on it. What's happening is subtle. A slow, strategic separation driven by pragmatism rather than ideology. And as Europe builds out these new relationships, the global economic map is quietly being redrawn. This is not about rebellion, but replacement. Building alternative options so that Europe's fate isn't tied entirely to decisions in Washington. The changes we're seeing in trade routes, investment flows, and industrial strategy will shape not just Europe's economy, but the global balance of power for decades. The quiet pivot we're witnessing today may well be one of the most important geopolitical shifts of the 21st century, precisely because it's happening without headlines and without drama. If you've stayed with me this far, you probably enjoy understanding the bigger picture behind the news. So if you found this breakdown useful, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ring the notification bell, and thank you for watching. It really helps keep this kind of deep dive analysis coming your way.